we will leave her last. No. Yeah, on the theme that was set this morning by our Kalan and subsequently through all the human rights experts, we have here today really, really authoritative speakers. And for the last few years, three things have been on the buzzword for Tibet. Chinese boarding school, DNA, and Sinicization. And we have three experts to say on this. And first of all, I want to thank all our speakers here. And since we are, I want to keep a very tight timetable, please. And I want to ask all the speakers to be brief and precise for about 15 to 20 minutes, that we give plenty of time for our audiences to raise very exciting questions that you may not think it was important. So we will go, sorry to announce that we have a small alteration to the panel here. Instead of Dr. Galola, we have Ladun Tetong talking on the same subject as boarding school. So I'll let Ladun Tetong to start her presentation. Thank you.
Sorry to disappoint you. I am not Dr. Gello, but Gello will speak tomorrow, and we've switched places, and I think you will get far more from him on the question of new colonialism by China in Tibet. And I will address today specifically the boarding schools. Thank you very much for the opportunity to do this. I know many people, in fact, most people here know about the issue of the colonial boarding school system in Tibet. I'd like to go just a little bit deeper today and discuss it as, you know, we keep talking about colonial boarding schools in Tibet, not because it is the only issue facing Tibetans, but because it really is an issue that so singly threatens the future of Tibet and Tibetan identity, but also encapsulates kind of all of the issues of the loss of language, potential loss of Tibetan language, the attack on religion, the Tibetan way of life, Tibetans not having the rights to choose their future, what's best for their children. It really all boils down so clearly into this single issue. So I just wanted to say that before I dive right in and talk about the schools again. So I've divided this up as what's happening, why it's happening, and what we're doing about it and what we can do in the future. And I'm going to time myself, and I'm reading because I also am terrible at staying to time. So what's happening? The Chinese Communist Party is intentionally cutting the children of Tibet off from their families and communities, and so also their language, culture, and religion, by placing them in a colonial boarding school system that now blankets all of Tibet, the entire Tibetan plateau, and not just what China calls the Tibet Autonomous Region, or Western and Central Tibet, but also all of Eastern Tibet and of the provinces of Kham and Amdo. This system eerily echoes the legacy of forced assimilation and ethnic elimination, genocide, that occurred in other historical residential school systems, including in Canada, in the US, and Australia. And while boarding schools have existed in Chinese-occupied Tibet for decades, especially for secondary students, the system that has been built now sweeps up nearly every school-aged child in all of Tibet. Not just high school students, not just middle school students, but children in primary school, and horrifically, even 4- and 5-year-olds in preschool. Tibet Action's research shows at least 800 to 900,000 Tibetan children from the ages of 6 to 18 now living in colonial boarding schools across Tibet. It's estimated that a further 100 to 150,000, and that is a conservative number, of Tibetan preschoolers ages 4 to 6 years old live in a completely hidden network of boarding preschools in rural Tibetan areas. Shockingly, just for the older set of students, 6 to 18, this means that 3 out of every 4 Tibetan children of school age are waking up nearly every single day and going to bed nearly every single night without any contact with their parents, their grandparents, their extended families, their traditional communities, and this includes lamas and monks and nuns. They're growing up and being shaped and molded to be Chinese and to think like a Chinese person before a Tibetan, and certainly before a Tibetan Buddhist. Day in and day out, they exist in a highly regimented and almost completely Chinese linguistic, social, cultural, and political environment. And while China does its best, the Chinese government now is doing its best to portray the education system as bilingual, it is not. Chinese, or Mandarin, is the medium of instruction throughout the education system in Tibet, and especially in the boarding schools. As far as we can tell, Tibetan language is most often offered as a single, separate language class, if at all. And we're not clear about the boarding preschools, how much Tibetan is even, or if Tibetan is even offered as a subject in those schools. For these children, contact with families is limited, and in our report we show researchers in one area of Eastern Tibet due to distance, for children in one area of Eastern Tibet due to distance and difficult travel conditions, as many as 80% of the children don't return home at all during the school year, even for the holidays. Often parents will come partway to meet them, or they'll go somewhere nearby for the school holidays. Another scholar observed a school in Lhasa where parents tried to visit their children, but they weren't allowed onto the school grounds, and this is typical. They periodically would try to bring their children treats or basic necessities to the perimeter fence, but this too was discouraged by the administrators and the teachers, who would tell the children they will lose academic points if they go to the fence. So why did parents even agree to send their children away to such schools? Because most of the time they have no choice or no options. Local village schools have been shut down. Private Tibetan-run schools and monastery day schools have been forced to close. So boarding school is all they have. And they want their children to receive education. They want their kids to be successful, or to at least have a chance in a very fast-changing Chinese-dominated world. Families who do try to resist sending their kids away, even to the residential boarding preschools, they're told their children will not be allowed to join or enroll later in school, or they face financial penalties, the loss of government. Some of them have to survive on government, some kind of government assistance or welfare. And their other children are threatened that they won't be allowed to attend school. And those who really try to organize, well, we know what happens to any kind of organized resistance in Tibet. And we have heard stories of communities who've tried to protest or really tried to resist the closure of their local village schools and sending their kids away. And they are told blatantly that we will make you pay and will collectively punish you. This is not new or unique to the Tibetan story, but when people talk about choice in Tibet, parental choice, I think this has to be clear that there really is no environment for any real choice or options here. So why is China doing this? Why is the Chinese government doing this? The residential school system is a central pillar in the broader effort by Beijing to co-opt, undermine, and ultimately eliminate Tibetan identity, with the goal of neutralizing Tibetan resistance to Chinese Communist Party rule and to China's rule in Tibet. Beijing's logic is that once Tibetans' identity as a distinct people is wiped out, that will be the end of the collective Tibetan consciousness, and there won't be a foundation on which to advocate for Tibetan rights as a group. And while residential boarding schools, of course, have been in Tibet in the past, what makes this current system so different and so incredibly dangerous is the unprecedented scope and scale and goal of the project. Since 2001, in all of China, under a policy called merged or concentrated schooling, village-level elementary schools were closed and replaced with township and county-level schools where boarding is usually mandatory. In China, this caused a major backlash amongst the public, and it led to, in 2012, the State Council to curb this trend as a whole and to say, quote, that primary schools in the first 3 grades should in principle be non-residential throughout the country, end quote. This directive went on to order local authorities to, quote, resolutely stop the blind withdrawal of rural compulsory education schools, end quote. The directive also required them to hold hearings with the public before closing any rural school and pointed out the legal responsibility of local administrations to provide facilities, school facilities within reach of children's homes. Since then, on a national level across China, it looks as if the percentage of boarding students has remained pretty constant at around 22%. On the contrary, for Tibetans, for Uyghurs, for Southern Mongolians, the 2015 decision on accelerating the development of ethnic education by the same State Council required officials to do exactly the opposite. It called on them to, quote, strengthen boarding school construction in minority areas and ordered them to achieve the goal that students of all ethnic minorities will study in a school, live in a school, and grow up in a school, end quote. And so as our report shows, Tibetan children are subjected to these schools at a vastly higher rate than Chinese children, even in rural China. For example, in 2018, 79.8% of elementary students in the Tibet Autonomous Region were in residential schools, compared to 14.1% of students in rural areas living in boarding schools across China, and that includes Tibet. It's clear that under Xi Jinping now, schools are the main battlefield for this so-called ethnic unity education. James Label, the well-known scholar of China and its ethnic policies, describes the essence of Xi Jinping's new policy towards Tibetans and others, like Uyghurs, Southern Mongolians, as a shift away from a more tolerance of ethnic difference towards a, quote, virulent form of cultural nationalism that pathologizes dissent and diversity as an existential threat to the party and to the nation, end quote. So facing this, what are we doing? Since launching the report in 2021, We have collectively, thank you to everyone here and especially to the Tibetan government, we have made some progress in bringing global attention to this issue. Key UN experts and committees have spoken out and used incredibly strong language calling for the abolition of colonial boarding schools in Tibet and the forced assimilation of Tibetan children through these school systems. States including Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, Czech Republic, the US, and Canada have all called for an end to China's forced assimilation of 1 million Tibetan children, with the US imposing visa restrictions on the Chinese Communist Party officials who are directly associated with the colonial boarding schools most recently. The United Kingdom has been at the forefront from the beginning on this issue and working to help bring attention to this issue as well. So China has responded directly, and the Chinese government has showed it is feeling the heat and that they care what the world thinks about this issue. They know this kind of campaign hurts their image, and it's why they have launched a major and rather unprecedented propaganda campaign for recent times anyways, including taking UN ambassadors from Geneva to Tibet, hosting events in Geneva alongside UN meetings, taking increased numbers of journalists to Tibet and taking them to sea boarding schools and preschools, which they're very quick to say are not boarding schools, and also releasing countless articles and slick videos featuring newly built schools, campuses, and Tibetans studying Tibetan and singing and dancing and wearing Tibetan clothes, and all of it really, new cafeterias with this incredible array of food, and all of it as evidence that these kids are happy, they're receiving good care from the state, and that, of course, that they are receiving bilingual education by showing, of course, always the one Tibetan language class that they, the 40 minutes, maybe the 60 minutes they have a day of their 10-hour school day in those videos and in that propaganda. But as Dr. Gallo says, facilities and one class are not evidence of good education or bilingual education, nor showing us these facilities and Tibetan children dressed up in Tibetan clothes and singing and dancing, nor is it an example or does it show us that the children are happy and that they want to be there and that they don't miss their parents. The colonial curriculum is the key. That we have not seen, that they are not showing us. Also, the intention to eliminate their identity and the taking them away from their parents, that's the issue. So please we can't let anyone or any governments or anyone be distracted by the facilities. This is the one way we can see things differing from, say, I grew up in Canada, the residential school system that we know, the genocidal school system that was so incredibly abusive and horrific to the First Nations, Indigenous, Métis, Inuit people of Canada. This system may have slightly newer buildings and slightly better facilities, but the principles are the same, the end goal is the same, and we need to remind all governments about that. For us at Tibet Action, this campaign against China's colonial boarding school system in Tibet is both about fighting for the rights of children and families being impacted by the system, and also about bringing the international spotlight back to Tibet, and to show that under Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, life is not good. Things are getting worse. Quiet from Tibet is not about people not resisting or there not being massive abuses and atrocities. It's just that China's campaign to silence Tibetans and the international community has been largely and sadly very successful in recent years. There's so much that we can do. I can see my time is running out. First and foremost, just on the question of the UPR, I'll say we need states and governments to raise this issue specifically, both because we have an obligation as the international community, especially governments, states with a history of residential school, colonial boarding school systems that wreaked so much havoc and have done so much damage for Indigenous people in this world, on Indigenous people in this world. So there's a responsibility, but there's also the practical point that China is trying to keep Tibet locked down and the spotlight off, so that we can't point to anything specifically and really say, look at how devastatingly horrific and bad and the threat this poses to the Tibetan future. Well, we now have this report, this evidence, Tibetans who've risked everything, Dr. Gello who's risked everything and lost so much in order to be able to speak on this issue. We need governments and states to raise the schools specifically and to tell China that it's not acceptable, the system must be abolished, and Tibetan children must have high-quality mother tongue education available to them locally. You can build the highest railroads in the world, you can build the highest airports in the world, you can conquer the highest place in the world. You can bring local education to Tibetan children. Tibet being a rural and Tibetan communities being sparsely populated across the plateau, not good enough excuse. A terrible excuse, actually, for taking almost all Tibetan children away from their families and for threatening the very future of our language, our culture, and identity. So I would ask all governments, anyone who's listening, Tibetans who are doing advocacy, our supporters who are doing advocacy, to help us bring this issue to the forefront so that people can understand what's happening in Tibet and what's at threat. Thank you.
Sadhana, what a powerful presentation. I didn't specifically introduce you because you are the author or you are the director of the Tibet Institute, which came up with this report. So it is so much better that you spoke what you own and how much you care about this. So let me introduce my next speaker, Ben Rogers, a great human rights campaigner all over Southeast Asia, I would say. China, Tibet, Uyghurs, Myanmar, Taiwan, Hong Kongers, and he has been a strong supporter of all the oppressed people under China. Thank you. So really, Ben Rogers has been a huge campaigner. He has formed the Hong Kong Watch Group. He has initiated many human rights campaign organizations. Last year, he visited Dharamsala, introduced, and he published a China Nexus book, which has a chapter of Uyghurs, Tibet, and so many other things. So because we are so precious with our time, I want to let Ben Rogers to have his piece. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's a really great pleasure and privilege to be here at the Geneva Forum. I want to thank the Central Tibetan Administration and the Office of Tibet and everybody who's been involved in organizing this. I did join one of the previous forums a couple of years ago virtually, but this is my first time in person, and I'm really glad to be here. As Sonam Frazi has said, I'm a friend of Tibet and very much a supporter of Tibet, and I had the great privilege of going to Dharamsala and meeting His Holiness earlier this year. And when I was writing my book, The China Nexus, I think one of the most heartbreaking but also rewarding chapters to write was researching and writing the chapter on Tibet, because I had the privilege of interviewing several Tibetans with extraordinary stories, and I learned a huge amount more through the process of researching and writing that chapter. But I want to, when I was reflecting on how I was going to approach this topic, I thought, even though I'm a friend and supporter of Tibet, I am not an expert on Tibet, and it would be rather absurd for me to talk about China's assimilationist policy in Tibet to a room full of Tibetans and Tibet experts, especially having just heard the really incredible and absolutely vital presentation on the boarding schools. So I would like to make some more general remarks about China's assimilationist policy across the board, and then some very specific remarks about what is happening in Hong Kong, because I think Hong Kong is the latest example of China's assimilationist policy, and you can see the same trajectory, albeit maybe taking slightly different forms, but the same trajectory starting there as what has been happening in Tibet and in East Turkestan and southern Mongolia for much longer. I also want to say how pleased I am that this forum is taking place at this critical time ahead of the Universal Periodic Review. And I spent the first few days this week in advocacy meetings with permanent missions here in Geneva in preparation for the UPR. And I hope that all of us, whether we're focused on Tibet or the Uyghurs or Hong Kong or southern Mongolia or all of these issues combined, I hope that we can work together to make sure that all these issues are featured as prominently as possible in the UPR. Let me start by saying that it is really clear, and I think all of us in this room knows this, that across the People's Republic of China, in every territory that it controls, the policy of the Chinese Communist Party regime is to silence dissent and repress ethnic, religious, cultural, and linguistic diversity. Its objective is Sinicization, which means Han nationalism, Mandarin language, and political loyalty to the CCP. It means, as the title of this session says, assimilation and crackdown. The assimilationist policy has three key elements: racial or ethnic, linguistic and cultural, and in the case of Tibet and the Uyghurs, East Turkestan, religious, and then thirdly, political, absolute loyalty to the CCP. And of course, it is coercive and repressive. The most egregious forms of this policy are, as we've just heard, in Tibet, and as we heard earlier from my friend Roshan Abbas, in East Turkestan and also southern Mongolia. But we are increasingly seeing it in Hong Kong as well. And the common factors you will recognize. In Hong Kong, we have seen in recent years a significant wave of migration from mainland China into Hong Kong, which inevitably is changing the demographics. In the decade from 2010 to 2020, 450,000 people moved from mainland China to Hong Kong using the one-way entry permit. They used to talk about one country, two systems. Now they have a one-way entry permit. In total, over 2.4 million out of Hong Kong's 7.4 million population are migrants from mainland China. And since 1997, the handover of Hong Kong, over 1 million have come from mainland China, accounting for 90% of the city's growth in population. Of course, this change in demographics is compounded by the fact that due to the crackdown in Hong Kong, in the last 3 years, hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers have left the city. More than 160,000 have come to the UK and others to Canada, Australia, the US, and elsewhere. Secondly, we are seeing the issue of language being used. Increasingly, Mandarin is replacing Cantonese in Hong Kong. Over half of Hong Kongers now speak Mandarin. Mainland Chinese children who've migrated to Hong Kong are unable to speak Cantonese. Over 67% of elementary schools use Mandarin now to teach Chinese language, and many schools are using Mandarin to teach other subjects as well. We're seeing greater use of simplified characters in Hong Kong, whereas Hong Kongers traditionally use traditional characters. And that's occurring in school textbooks in particular. And in August this year, the home of the founder of a Cantonese language advocacy group was raided, and the group was disbanded. So advocating for the protection of Cantonese language is now politically increasingly dangerous. Thirdly, we are seeing the introduction of the patriotism test. In 2020, there was the imposition of the national anthem law just before the national security law, and that criminalizes so-called insults to the national anthem. Then there was the introduction of the oath of allegiance for legislators, for district councillors, for civil servants, for judges, for other public officials. They have to take an oath of allegiance. Now, many countries require an oath of allegiance, but we all know that in this case, this is an oath not to the country or the state, but to the regime that runs the state. They talk about having a patriots-only legislature, and indeed the entire pro-democracy camp that used to have a sizable presence in the legislature has been completely pushed out, both of the Legislative Council and also of the District Council seats, even though in the last District Council elections in 2019, they won an overwhelming majority of seats. We're seeing patriotism combined with national security law education in schools, and compulsory school and university visits to the mainland on a regular basis, and advertised and promoted as a visit to the motherland. Fourthly, we're seeing the rewriting of history. School textbooks now in Hong Kong on citizenship claim that that Hong Kong was never a British colony. Now, how the UK took Hong Kong, how Hong Kong became a British colony, is not necessarily something that we would be proud of. I think we can be proud of some of the things that happened in Hong Kong, but how Hong Kong became a British colony in the Opium Wars with the unequal treaties in the 19th century is not something that most British people would be particularly proud of, but it is a historical fact. And it is a historical fact and a legal fact that Hong Kong Island was leased to the United Kingdom under those treaties for 99 years. But China has rewritten that and said it was never a colony, it was instead an occupied territory. And lastly, the issue of censorship. We've seen almost complete shutdown of independent media in Hong Kong, the removal of hundreds of books from public libraries. At least 250 book titles have been removed from public libraries in the last couple of years to ensure that the CCP's narrative of history and of identity prevails. We've seen a total ban now on commemoration of the June 4th Tiananmen Square massacre. Hong Kong used to be the only part of the People's Republic of China until a couple of years ago where it was possible to commemorate Tiananmen. And there used to be big candlelit vigils in Victoria Park. Those now are illegal. And the last remaining commemorations, which were held in Catholic churches in Hong Kong up until 2 years ago, they have now stopped as well. We're seeing increasing censorship in the arts in terms of any both political expression but also expression of Hong Konger identity in the arts. And most especially, perhaps the most visible assault on Hong Kongers' desire to express their identity comes in the forceful ban on the pro-democracy movement's anthem, Glory to Hong Kong. I note that over the last year or so, there have been a number of sporting events around the world, in other parts of the world, where Hong Kong teams have been playing, and instead of playing the Chinese anthem, whoever was responsible for arranging the anthems played, I'm sure not accidentally, Glory to Hong Kong, and that caused numerous complaints from the Hong Kong government and from Beijing trying to get that shut down. We also see economic assimilation. They now talk not so much about Hong Kong as the Greater Bay Area. And Hong Kong is being morphed into one large economic zone linking Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, other cities in the region with bridges and train connections and job opportunities. And that business environment is creating greater dependency on the mainland and a softer form of assimilation. We're also seeing Sinicization of religion in Hong Kong. The assault on religion in Hong Kong is not as physical or as overt or as obvious as it is in Tibet or East Turkestan. But it is a creeping Sinicization, a creeping censorship of what is preached in churches and other places of worship, and a creeping engagement between religious organizations in Hong Kong being coerced to engage with the patriotic, the state-controlled religious organizations in mainland China, and Xi Jinping's Sinicization of religion, which has taken place very extensively across the mainland, is now coming into Hong Kong. Let me turn, before I close, just in a moment, to the second part of the title of this panel, the assimilationist policy, but also the crackdown. The crackdown on defenders in Hong Kong has been dramatic, extensive, and rapid in the last few years. Almost all pro-democracy activists and human rights defenders in Hong Kong are either in prison, in exile, or have been silenced. I used to, before the draconian national security law was imposed on Hong Kong, I used to speak to people in Hong Kong by phone, by Signal, by WhatsApp, if not every day, certainly multiple times a week. I now cannot speak to anybody in Hong Kong directly, and that's because most of my friends are in prison. Those who aren't in prison, if they're in exile, of course, I am in touch with them. But if they're not in prison or in exile, I don't want to contact them because contact with me could really endanger them. Take the example of Jimmy Lai, the founder of the Apple Daily newspaper, who's already spent 3 years in jail and still has not yet faced his national security law trial, which keeps being delayed. And when that does come, it's highly likely he'll spend the rest of his life in jail. Earlier this year, the Hong Kong authorities issued arrest warrants for 8 exiled Hong Kong activists with million-dollar Hong Kong dollar bounties against them. And they then pulled in the family members of some of those 8 for questioning and for pressure. So as I draw to a close, let me just say this. Hong Kong was promised autonomy for 50 years from the time of the handover, one country, two systems, under an international treaty, the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And less than halfway through that period, all of those promises have been completely dismantled. So the question for all of us, to all the things that we're hearing in this Geneva Forum, is how to respond. How do we respond to the cultural genocide and the atrocities in Tibet that have been going on for so many decades? How do we respond to the genocide of the Uyghurs, to crimes against humanity, and to the dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms, autonomy, and identity, turning Hong Kong into simply just another Chinese city? Well, I think it's vital that as many of us as possible engage with the UPR process over the next couple of months. It's vital that we seek international pressure, including sanctions for all of these crimes and atrocities. I think that we should form, Tibetans, Southern Mongolians, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, form a united front to counter the CCP's united front. And it's vital that we seek accountability and stand up to this repressive, expansionist, aggressive, assimilationist, and criminal regime. Thank you.
Our band, thank you so much for such a moving presentation. One thing I really like, what I appreciate about our Geneva Forum is we are bringing in all the interested groups who are suffering under the Chinese Communist Party. And this is such a huge, big platform that we can learn what is happening in other minority or nationalities, and we can see a pattern. Everything is being compartmentalized and repeated by the Chinese Communist Party. So thank you for that. And let me introduce my last speaker. I am meeting Emil Dirk for the first time in my life. Thank you for coming for this. But the subject that you and your organization, your university, has been involved has been a great, great learning as well as a huge knowledge that the Tibetan diaspora as well as Tibetans are learning. And let me read his, let me introduce him by reading what he wrote here, so because I'm not very familiar with what you do, sorry. So he's a researcher at the Citizen Lab at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy in the University of Toronto, where he explored state surveillance, policing, and politics in China. His research on biometric surveillance has been covered in the New York Times, The Economist, The Intercept, among other publications. Let me give Emil the floor to explain everything that he knows and he discovered. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. It's a privilege to attend the forum with so many people. Thank you to everyone who organized, and I consider this to be a real learning experience for myself. So today I want to talk about 2 police-led biometric data collection programs in the People's Republic of China that I've explored as a researcher at the Citizen Lab. The first is a mass DNA collection program in the Tibet Autonomous Region, and the second is a mass iris scan collection program in neighboring Qinghai province. Both are population-wide surveillance programs that have targeted hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Both programs are unconnected to ongoing criminal or missing persons investigations, and both programs have the potential to severely impact the rights of the people in both of those regions. Now, despite my presence at today's forum, I am by no means an expert on Tibet. Others here can undoubtedly do a better job than myself in situating these programs within the context of decades of state repression in Tibet. Instead, I approach these topics as someone who, as a researcher, is generally concerned with policing and politics in contemporary China. So as much as these 2 programs that I'll be discussing today are unique to the TAR and Qinghai, these programs also reflect, I think, broader features of China under the Xi Jinping administration. So first, under Xi, mass biometric data collection is increasingly a characteristic of policing in China, not just in these 2 regions, but across the People's Republic. And second, police-led mass biometric data collection programs of the sort I'll be talking about today do not appear to be grounded in Chinese domestic law. So my understanding of these 2 programs emerged out of analysis of publicly available online sources, the vast majority of which are Chinese language social media posts made by local public security bureaus in both the TAR and in Qinghai. Those interested in either of these programs or what I'll be discussing today can go to the Citizen Lab website. You can download the reports. You can also download the raw data as an Excel file and actually look at the sources yourself. So with the first, I'll look at each program in turn. The first one, mass DNA collection in the TAR, dates back to at least mid-2016 and at least up to mid-2022, which is when my research on this program ended. As you can see from these pictures, police obtained DNA samples via a pinprick to the finger, with a blood sample then collected on a piece of specially treated paper. These samples and the personal information of the individual are added to what some of these sources refer to as local population gene databases. It's not clear if these gene databases are directly added to pre-existing police-run forensic DNA databases, though it is very clear that these local population gene databases of Tibetans are managed by the police, by those public security bureaus. While there's some indication that in some cases health officials participated in some instances of DNA collection, this has clearly been a police-led program. Photographs also give us a good idea of who the police have targeted for data collection and where. Police have collected samples from men, women, and children, including kindergarten students and monks. There's no indication that any of these people are criminal suspects, nor is there any indication that these individuals were suspected of any kind of anti-state or unsanctioned religious activity. Instead, police seem to have targeted entire communities and collected DNA samples en masse in areas like fields, schools, private businesses, and government buildings. I would also like to note, again, for people who are interested in this program, Human Rights Watch did a great report on this, came out around the same time that mine came out, and I would very much encourage everyone to take a look at their report as well. So the second program, again, my understanding of iris scan collection in Qinghai province, again, comes from examination of publicly available sources, Chinese language social media posts made by public security bureaus in that province. Mass iris scan collection in Qinghai dates back to early 2019 and ran to at least mid-2022. In many ways, it looks very similar to the DNA collection program in the TAR. So again, as you can see from these pictures, police collected iris scans using a handheld device which is connected to a laptop computer. Police added iris scans to files on the individual that they targeted, with these files then added to databases managed by public security bureaus. As in the TAR, police in Qinghai targeted men, women, and children. We also know from photographs that police collected scans from the elderly and students and Buddhist nuns. Photographs also indicate that in some cases those people who were targeted were members of Muslim communities. None of these people appear, again, to be criminal suspects, nor again do they seem to be taking part or suspected of taking part in unsanctioned political activity or participants in unsanctioned religious activity. As in the TAR, police seem to have targeted entire communities and to have collected iris scans, again, en masse in private homes, government offices, at police stations, in schools, temples, and at construction sites. And there, again, others have done some great work on this. There is a report that was done by the online magazine Bitter Winter. I believe their report might have come out in 2020. Again, for those who are interested in the program, I'd also encourage you to look at their report as well. So there are no authoritative, publicly available sources which lay out the scope of these two programs. However, some of the sources that I was able to find do provide data on the number of biometric data samples that were collected by police within a given local area. These local totals, in turn, can provide a basis for estimating the size of the two programs. And clearly, both programs are massive. In the TAR, I estimate that by mid-2022, police had collected DNA samples from between 1/4 to 1/3 of the TAR's population, or roughly 919,000 to 1.2 million people. In Qinghai, by mid-2022, police had collected iris scans from between 1/5 to 1/4 of the province's population, or between 1.2 to 1.4 million people. Local authorities in both regions have provided mixed or vague justifications for data collection. These justifications include everything from combating criminal or terrorist activity, maintaining social stability, finding missing people, assisting population management, or even upgrading national ID cards. It's possible, actually, that the police do not have a single purpose behind the collection of this massive amount of biometric data. Police could very well use iris recognition tools or population-wide DNA databases to identify missing people. Or police could also use these same tools as part of broader programs of state control and repression. The people of Qinghai and the TAR are already subject to intense government surveillance and control, including the detention of activists and severe restrictions on cultural and religious activities. Biometric surveillance tools of the sort that my reports detail could become one more tool of social control in the police's arsenal. It's also important to point out that police do not even need to routinely use these programs for these programs to have an impact on the people in these regions. Police awareness of surveillance programs alone can have a chilling effect on the communities that police target. So as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of opinion and expression observed in the 2019 report, Surveillance and Human Rights, quote, "In environments subject to rampant illicit surveillance, the targeted communities know of or suspect such attempts at surveillance, which in turn shapes and restricts their capacity to exercise the rights to freedom of expression, association, religious belief, culture, and so forth," end quote. So it's possible that mass biometric surveillance programs in the TAR and Qinghai may likewise restrict the freedom of expression, association, and belief of the people in those regions. Now, As concerning as both of these programs are, and they're deeply concerning, these are not the only police-led mass biometric surveillance programs in China. In fact, we know of at least 2 others. The first of these is in Xinjiang, or East Turkestan, where as part of a campaign of state repression and mass detainment beginning in the mid-2010s, police and other authorities reportedly collected biometric data from perhaps millions of the region's residents. One document released by the government of the city of Aksu suggests that authorities were ordered to collect DNA, iris scans, fingerprints, and facial scans from all of the residents aged 12 to 65. Human Rights Watch, the New York Times, and other researchers have documented this program, and I would encourage everyone to consult their work. The second of these mass biometric surveillance programs is the Ministry of Public Security's creation of a national or a nationwide male DNA database. So since at least 2017, police across China have collected DNA samples from potentially tens of millions of men and boys, and genealogical records of their extended male family members. While police have justified the creation of this so-called male ancestry investigation system as a crime prevention measure or as a way to find missing people, none of the men and boys targeted for DNA collection appear to be criminal suspects or relatives of missing individuals. Instead, the program appears to be an attempt to massively increase the number of male genetic reference profiles in China's forensic DNA databases. Again, those interested can refer to a report I wrote back in 2020 for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute with James Leibold. So, Chinese police have a long-standing interest in the use of biometric technologies for the purpose of crime control and population management, dating back to the creation of China's first forensic DNA database in 2003 under Hu Jintao. Yet mass biometric data collection, which targets entire populations or entire regions, increasingly appears to be a particular characteristic of policing under the Xi Jinping administration. There are a few reasons for this. Advances in biometric technologies have permitted greater data collection, processing, and sharing than ever before. The growth of international and domestic markets for biometric technologies has also reduced the cost of collecting, processing, and sharing data. Yet perhaps the core reason why police-led mass biometric data collection has expanded over the last decade is the Chinese government's particular fixation on national security. So under Xi, the Chinese government has adopted an increasingly broad view of what activities or what groups potentially threaten national security. So to combat these perceived threats, authorities have adopted a range of measures, including tightening controls on domestic and foreign NGOs, imposing a national security law in Hong Kong, and pursuing opponents and critics overseas through transnational repression. But for Chinese police, the current fixation on national security has led to a significant expansion in the police's domestic surveillance programs. As the Chinese government has grown more concerned with internal challenges to its power, the police have been tasked with monitoring ever greater numbers of Chinese citizens, and this expansion of domestic surveillance includes the expansion of the kind of biometric surveillance programs that I've been researching. So, mass biometric data collection, I think, is also a reminder of what is referred to by some scholars as China's law stability paradox, or the tension between China's efforts to build a robust legal system and the Chinese government's willingness to act outside of that legal system to defend its authority. So mass biometric data collection in the TAR and Qinghai appear to be at odds with existing Chinese laws on police collection of biometric data. So for example, China's criminal procedure law states that police can collect biological samples or biometric samples during criminal proceedings. The anti-terrorism law states that police can collect biometric data when investigating suspected terrorist activity. And the resident identity card law states that Chinese citizens applying for a national ID card must register their fingerprints with the authorities. However, neither police collection of DNA in the TAR or iris scans in Qinghai would seem to fall under the conditions set out by any of these laws. Those targeted for DNA or iris scan collection do not seem to be victims or suspects in criminal or anti-terror investigations, nor do these people appear to be applying for ID cards. So that the fact that police in the TR and Qinghai are acting beyond the bounds of Chinese law is not surprising. What is surprising, at least to me, is that while police were collecting biometric data en masse in these two regions, the Chinese government was also introducing legislation offering clearer protections for the personal data of Chinese citizens. So provisions in the 2021 Civil Code of the People's Republic states that people have the right to privacy and that their personal information, including biometric information, is protected by law. And the 2021 Personal Information Protection Law also states that state organs handling personal information must do so in line with relevant laws and regulations. So to me, this raises a question: isn't there a tension between the Chinese government promising to safeguard personal privacy on the one hand and Chinese police engaging in mass biometric surveillance in places like the TR and Qinghai on the other? To me, I think that it's possible that the Chinese government sees no such tension. In their eyes, no such tension exists. That's because laws on personal data privacy are meant to limit the power, largely, of private sector actors to collect and process personal data. These moves are in keeping with China's long-standing efforts to develop a robust legal system, both as a nation-building project and as a bedrock for economic development. However, Chinese laws on personal privacy are not intended to meaningfully constrain China's domestic security agencies. This is because in areas where regime stability comes into conflict with individual rights, China's legal system invariably privileges the former. The Chinese Communist Party has consistently rejected the idea that its power should be checked by domestic institutions like the judiciary or the legislature or even China's own constitution. What's more, there are very few countervailing forces in China capable of checking police powers. China has no independent courts, mass social movements, free press, or opposition political parties which can openly and consistently challenge the power of the police to collect biometric data en masse. The only real check on police power in China is the Communist Party, and given that it is the Chinese government which has tasked the police with implementing these biometric surveillance projects, the Chinese government is unlikely to constrain the power of the police to actually collect biometric data from the Chinese public outside of ongoing criminal investigations or anti-terror investigations or missing persons investigations. I'll end here, but I just want to make one final note, which is that this discussion of law shouldn't also distract us from the fact that even if the Chinese government was to reveal a legal basis for these programs or to establish a post facto legal basis for mass biometric data collection, this would not make these programs acceptable on human rights grounds. I think the work that I've done with the lab, the work that others at Human Rights Watch, Bitter Winter have done, looking at these programs, I think clearly indicates that the mass collection of biometric data from men, women, and children in these regions is a massive violation of the rights of those people who have been targeted. I'll end things here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Emil. What a fascinating and also not so nice to hear story, but never mind, it happens. So I think we got half an hour, and speakers have been very timely to finish their presentation on time. What I would like to, before I open the floor to the audiences to ask questions, I want to say for about 20-25 minutes, we will have question and answer. And then since we have few minutes, we can have 3 minutes for each of the presenters to give a summary of what each one of them would like to say further on. So before I open the session for others, while you all are thinking about your questions, let me ask one question each for each of you to start with. Dr. Emil, do you think there is any evidence that this DNA collection, has there been any relations to organ harvesting that we see in Uyghur community? Is there a possibility? That's one question for you afterwards, yeah? And maybe for Ladunla, do we have specific names or database of schools where all your collections took place, and where we can identify all the schools, and perhaps through some satellite imaging we can extract those places? So it would be for advocacy that such information would be so important and evidential. So something like this, if you can talk something on that. And for Ben, do you think what is happening in Hong Kong and others, Tibetans have already experienced, but how we can bring all the, apart from your United Fronts organization, how can we do more to work together? Okay, we have this once a year, but is there any, can we build up some kind of a network? Perhaps you can throw a light, because you are so much involved in so many human rights issues.
Sure.
Thank you.
You want to go in reverse order?
Reverse order, yeah?
Oh, reverse. Oh, I see. Oh, yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think you've asked each of us very important questions. I think that this Geneva Forum is an incredibly important start, and I really want to pay tribute to and say how much I appreciated, I was going to say doctor, I know you're not Dr. Xiao Jiang, for what you said earlier and your courage in, despite the threats that were made to you all those years ago, standing so openly with Tibetans and Uyghurs and others. And I think that if we can find more opportunities, not only for the groups that are, if you like, on the peripheries of the PRC, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Southern Mongolians, to stand together, but for all of those to find more allies among mainland Chinese activists, if not in China, because obviously that's extremely difficult, at least outside China, and to work more and to build up more alliances of that kind, the better. Exactly what form that takes, I think, needs some further thought. I am encouraged, though, that when I first started working on these issues some years ago, it was quite rare to find, usually there would be a protest for Tibet, and then a protest for the Uyghurs, and a protest for Hong Kongers, and now those communities are protesting together. I see it in London, I see it in other parts of the world much more often, and that's really encouraging, and I think we can build on that.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely, we need a database. Of course, the Chinese government doesn't make it easy to, the Chinese authorities don't make it easy to find any information like a list of schools or how many students, how many Tibetan students are in all of these places. We have started, so two things. There are the colonial boarding school system for 6 to 18-year-olds, which they don't deny exists. And then there's the preschool boarding system that is hidden, that purposely hidden in rural Tibet. There are preschool day schools that exist in urban areas, but of course Tibet is majority rural, and so those day schools, those preschool day schools, are for serving a much smaller population of little ones. So we are working on a list of the boarding preschools that we know exist, and that is somewhat pressing and urgent because, of course, they deny that they exist, or they don't seem to admit to it at all, and there's no record or evidence of kids that little in boarding. So we're working on that first, but we do have, and we are trying to collect through, we've actually built a tool that will hopefully be able to release, at least for Tibetans, to start recording where they may have attended a colonial boarding school in the past. or where they know of schools. There are some that appear in the media, and then actually the satellite or even just, Google Maps, we can see schools, we can see the playgrounds, they might not be labeled, oftentimes they're not labeled as a school, but we can tell they are. And so we're working on a way to scrape that information and make it available. But this is, I think, key to the question, how did Tibet get sort of lost and fall off of the international community's map and radar in recent years? China has so effectively blocked access to Tibet. So for researchers or for any independent person or body wanting to look at what's happening there, Tibetans, transnational repression has made Tibetans in exile very, very reticent to bring that information forward in any meaningful way. And people inside Tibet have been punished, in some cases recently, more severe punishments for those who share information than for those who participate in a protest or do something overtly political. So it's hard.
Thank you.
So on the question of organ harvesting, I haven't seen any evidence that there's a link between mass DNA collection in the Tibet Autonomous Region or frankly anywhere else and that particular issue. My sense is that the Chinese police are engaging in mass DNA collection from populations largely in order to build up what are called like reference profiles so that it becomes, in their mind, easier to connect any kind of genetic trace left at a potential crime scene back to an individual. I also think, though, that this is connected to a larger feature of policing in China, which is the idea of just gathering up as much information as they possibly can about various people or populations and then trying to figure out what to do with it later. So I think the abuse there is just the ability of the police to intrude into the privacy, the private lives of citizens, and in so doing, remind them that they're under constant surveillance from the police or from the authorities. And again, as I mentioned, they don't necessarily even need to do anything with the information they've collected, be it biometric data or otherwise other kinds of personal identifying information. I think the mere fact of actually doing this is communicative. It shows the public, it shows individuals that the police have the power to do this, whether or not the law actually gives them the power. They have the authority to do this, and they have the authority, again, to intrude on the lives of those people and to discipline them as they see fit.
Thank you. Now, can we have questions from the floor? Whoever wants to ask, please identify yourself by name. Okay, this lady here.
Sorry.
You want to ask? Okay, Martin. Yeah.
Thank you to, first of all the amazing three speakers for their very illuminating presentation. I just have a very short two-part question to Dr. Emil regarding surveillance. First, is there any international law that looks into and oversee the making and usage of, softwares by companies like Huawei and Baidu and SensorTime that increasingly surveilled targeted groups? Secondly, how do you see in future what will be the role of artificial intelligence in increasing and comprehensively increasing surveillance of the Tibetans or the Uyghurs or the targeted groups, and what will be the impact of that, technology? So, thank you.
So in terms of the international environment, I think one thing that seems fairly clear to me looking at China and looking at other countries is that really the technology, be it in China or elsewhere, to engage in either biometric data collection or biometric data analysis has really surpassed the ability of the law to kind of constrain it, or sort of conventions. And in fact, while I think what China's doing is exceptionally egregious in terms of, again, mass collection of biometric data, you do see similar kinds of abuses by police forces outside of China, including in the United States and even in Canada and elsewhere. So actually, the environment that China is operating in, again, what they're doing is much larger in terms of scale, in a way more open, again, more egregious. But I think the fact is that there is a bit of a gap right now in terms of the norms surrounding how police or state bodies can use these technologies and for what purposes, right? I think this is probably also one of the reasons why it's important for civil society actors, researchers, members of affected communities and whatnot to actually speak out and testify to the impact of these technologies, right? In many ways to inform kind of public understanding about what this will actually lead to. And I think it's also the reason why when we're looking at something like mass DNA collection or iris scan collection, it's important to situate that in relation to other kinds of harms or to the relationship between, say, police forces or security agencies and larger publics, right? So it's not simply a matter of people going into a community to collect DNA. It's a particular state agency which has a history of repression and an abuse towards that population, right? Which in turn would tend to lead us to think, well, okay, if they have the capacity to do this, if they're assembling this kind of tool, might this in turn be used for purposes that they've already expressed an interest in the past? Again, state control or repression. In terms of the AI thing, I think that's a bit harder for me to answer. I think maybe one thing I would just say is that even with China, I know there's a tendency to look at China and assume that it's a kind of perfect surveillance state. It's operates exactly as it says on the tin, right? China's police force is also, by its own admission, you look at kind of Chinese academic writing or interviews of police officers, police are overworked, they're underpaid. At the end of the day, these systems really only succeed or fail based on the individuals who are tasked with kind of managing those systems. So I think in some cases, the discussion of AI, the discussion of these advanced technologies shouldn't disguise the fact that actually, the people who are implementing them are people on the ground. And if you look at the DNA collection program, it's huge, but you also look, it starts in mid-2016 and takes years and years to accomplish, right? The male DNA collection program probably dates back to about 2017 and is still going on. And there's a reason for that. It's because these are very big programs and they require quite a lot of interbureaucratic cooperation.
We get some more questions. Dr. Martin.
Thank you, Martin Mills. Question for Emil again, sorry. That's true, yeah. I must admit the DNA collection still sits in my head as something of a mystery. There's something about it which is scratching at the back of my brain that I can't quite grasp here. And so a couple of questions with that in mind. The first is you've cross-referenced this with the law. Have you cross-referenced it with any academic discussions? Chinese Academy of Sciences, use of DNA data, that kind of stuff?
There is Chinese academic writing generally on forensic DNA databases, and in some of those articles, these are not talking specifically about the program in the TAR or about the male DNA collection program, but those articles do note, some authors note, the sensitivity around mass DNA collection, and that this possibly could essentially end up being a bit of a public relations disaster for the police.
Okay, I mean, I say this, sorry, this is a slightly long question, but I say this because, of course, there's been a long-standing interest in the Chinese Academy of Sciences with Tibetan DNA, particularly in terms of things like altitude resistance and things on those lines. So I just wonder whether or not that might reveal something in a way that, for example, looking into biometric testing back in the 1920s in Africa, you would cross-hatch that with the academic discussions on race and the Hamitic hypothesis and things on those lines. I'm not saying that's the reason, I'm just speculating here. The other is the question, is the personal data that is collected, does that include kinship networks?
Most likely that could be inferred from other data that's being collected. The male DNA program.
I'm just thinking about this utilization of kin as a form of communal pressure.
Yeah, I would assume so. Again, the male DNA collection program, it's much more obvious because they are collecting multi-generational kind of genealogical family trees going back 5 generations.
Okay.
I would assume, though, with the DNA they're collecting or information they're collecting, whether in the TAR or Tsinghai, the information on an individual is connected to a larger population information the police already possess, and from that you could infer or see kinship relations.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. I just firstly wanted to thank the Central Tibetan Administration for organising this today. It's incredible to have everyone here in one place, and all the panelists as well. I actually wanted to respond to Mr. Fraser's question to Mr. Rogers, and your mention of a network, because funnily enough, I'm here on behalf of a global network of unrepresented nations and peoples. We're called the UNPO, the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, of which the Central Tibetan Administration is a member, as well as a member from Southern Mongolia and the World Uyghur Congress as well. We have plenty of members in the rest of Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Myanmar as well, the Nagalim. And yeah, the purpose of it is to create a global community, a network of unrepresented peoples. And so we'd be delighted to participate or help facilitate some conversations between different groups interested in the PRC. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a general statement. Yeah, you want to answer?
Just to say, I really welcome that offer and that comment. And as we had lunch together earlier, and if I can do anything to help recommend Hong Kong individuals or groups that could be part of this, because I think they're not yet, then I'd be delighted to.
I'd like to, if I may, venture one last question, and this can be answered by any panel member. Apps like Weibo and WeChat are often used in order to watch the activities of Chinese nationals in America, and also to monitor any anti-China movements within America. Now, I know that Donald Trump tried to outright ban them and was met with lots of backlash, and Biden has promised to unban them, but also to try to monitor them more tightly. Do you three think that it could be an effective form of, in a sense, counter surveillance to tighten American control and analysis of these apps? Or on the other hand, would you call that a counterproductive effort?
So I'm not an expert on this field, but many of my colleagues at the Citizen Lab have looked at content moderation on Chinese platforms. So I think if you are interested in specifically how these platforms operate and how information on them is moderated by censors working for those companies, how information may or may not be relayed to the Chinese state, I would encourage you to go on the Citizen Lab's website and look into that. My general sense from looking at the work of my colleagues is that there are things that are particularly egregious about, say, content moderation or surveillance on Chinese mobile applications. But I think there's also a much broader problem with social media companies or tech companies in general in the way that they handle or mishandle the data of their users. So I think probably for many people who are concerned about the issues that you raised, one of the things that might be necessary is actually thinking of this beyond just the issue of China and looking at other platforms, be it Twitter or X now, Facebook or any of these platforms, and trying to figure out like what are the standards that we should hold all of them to, right? As opposed to trying to come up with policies that target either one particular application or applications which are associated with one particular country.
Thank you very much. So now maybe I will invite Dr. Emil to say your concluding for maybe a couple of minutes, and then a couple of hours. After that, I'll ask Ben, and then to Tethon.
I don't know if I had all my words, and now I have no more words. But I think I'll just end by saying, again, I think being in a place like this is very humbling to me because, again, my academic training is focused on China, Chinese policing, Chinese governance. I do not have the kind of knowledge and experience and depth of expertise as many of the people here right, when it comes to Tibet or other regions, Southern Mongolia and East Turkestan. So again, I'm just really enjoying the opportunity to be around everyone and to chat with people and to learn more. You know, again, it's a very humbling experience, but I'm quite enjoying my time at the forum. That's all I have.
Well, thank you. Firstly, I echo those remarks that it's already been a great pleasure and privilege and learning experience to be here, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the program tomorrow. I think to sum up, from my perspective, this topic of China's assimilationist policy and its crackdown on defenders, what's clear, even if it takes somewhat different forms in different areas of the territories that the Chinese Communist Party control, there are definitely some common approaches and common themes. And it's clear that the Chinese Communist Party wants to control language, reduce or even eliminate the use of other languages and impose the use of Mandarin. It wants to control, or probably in its ideal view of its own, eliminate religion. And we see that whether it's Tibetan Buddhism, Islam in East Turkestan, and increasingly the churches in Hong Kong. We see their objective is to control identity, control culture, to do that through controlling education, the economy, and politics. And those are pretty much every sphere of life. That is the objective of this regime, whether it's in Tibet, East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia, or Hong Kong, or any other part of its territory. And I think we can all learn from that and work together to counter it.
So I guess zooming out a little bit, I think it's, for me, having attended many panels and, you know, I've been doing this work in some ways a long time, in other ways not, for a little over 20-some years, and watching the changing world that Tibetans live in, the way that attention comes and goes, the way our elders are getting older and leaving us, and how the situation seems, you know, from the outside, it just seems to be getting worse. But I'm struck by how much Tibetans continue to rally and to fight or to push back at, even against this most powerful regime, and even in this worst time under Xi Jinping. And I would point to, most recently in Tibet, there was a teaching, Kala Chakra teaching, that we mostly know of His Holiness the Dalai Lama doing these teachings in exile. And this teaching happened in eastern Tibet, actually right in an area that is just surrounded by these, what we know exist, residential boarding preschools and boarding schools. And I think, so the numbers are, it's not certain, but if anybody has seen the footage or the videos online or the photos, I think locally they believe over 1 million Tibetans came to this teaching. Certainly from looking at the visual evidence, at least 500,000 people were there. And so people have said to us, this just happened in September, people have said to us, wow, I mean, religious freedom to a certain extent in Tibet. And I just wanted to say, you know, not only is that not the case, I think in spite of the incredible restrictions on religious practice and all Tibetan life in Tibet, people came out because they so desperately wanted to be Tibetan and to live in a Tibetan way and to attend a Buddhist teaching from a great teacher, because that is who we are. And that is what Tibetans do. And I've been lucky to witness it in exile in my life. But this was in Tibet at a time under the most powerful, brutal dictator, totalitarian regime and state. And it was like Tibetans giving again a sign to all of us outside that they are still there, they are still fighting. It looks different than a straight up protest, or 2008 or 59 or 87, or you name the year of, you know, uprising and protest. But the young people were there, the old people were there, and they were, I mean, really incredible to witness what they were saying. And they were saying, we're Tibetan, we're not Chinese. They didn't have to say it. It was there for us to see, and this is who we want to be. And they are, as long as there are 500,000 people, I mean, I don't know when, under the Communist Party since 1989, Tiananmen Square, I was trying to think, like, when have this many people gathered? Other than in Hong Kong, which is a very different situation than inside Tibet. So that is what we have to look to. That is the spirit that we keep going forward. All the young Tibetans who are here, I mean, this is a difficult time, but we're still fighting, we're still here. By all accounts, we shouldn't be. The odds are stacked against us and have been for 70 years. So we just keep going forward and sticking true to the star that we see guiding us from inside Tibet. And as long, you know, lucky as we have His Holiness still here in this life with us, and the Tibetan government acting as our, you know, exile leadership, we just keep doing the hard work and we will find our way. And together, I think with our obvious allies, and unfortunately our ranks swell with the broader the persecution and the crackdown goes, but we continue to challenge the Chinese leadership at every turn. And I believe what Xiao says, they are weak. They are not as strong as they appear. And things change like that. We know that. So we just keep doing this work, and we keep, if we have to educate a whole new generation of international leaders about what is the situation in Tibet and what happened in the history, fine, we do it. You know, we will just do it until we get there.
Thank you, all my speakers, the audiences, especially the younger Tibetans here who are attending, perhaps for the first time, learning the ropes as it were. We have heard so much. We have been campaigning so much today, and it is my pleasure that I have been hearing so much about the campaigns that we are doing and the materials that have been presented here. One thing is for sure, that we will be all the time. I don't think Tibetan story will die. China wants Tibetan story to die. Recently, I had a note, a handwritten note from China, and he is actually a guy from UK. He went to Beijing to attend a conference, and they have been taken around to the famous museum in Xining. And he said, Sonam is done so beautifully, so, you know, everything is so nice story. But he said, the Dalai Lama story ended in 1933. So this is the erasure, the memory of Tibetan story, the memory of Tibetan history is being erased. And this China will not succeed, because we are a mountain people, I always believe. We have seen the peaks and troughs. This is in us. And we have seen throughout our history, we have seen ups and downs. And as long as Tibetans everywhere are interested in keeping the flame alive, we will be there. And if, as His Holiness goes, we will be the single mosquito that will keep Xi Jinping and CCP alive. So it is, I sometimes quote this all the time. This mosquito is a very powerful phrase that what one individual, what one person, what one organization can do You don't need a swarm of mosquito to bite an individual, go without sleep. One can do. So everybody can, need to power ourselves. So with this, I want to conclude by thanking everybody here. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and everything, passion, and thank you so much for the DIR to organize this. And I think we got some presentations to do before I finish. Thank you so much. Dr. Emil, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, sharing your resources. We appreciate that very much. And this is what we do all the time. Never give up. Thank you. Thank you so much. Satana can, I'm sure, open a shop of kata. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I'm sure she has this many
My son needs this.
many times. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's tea time.